Welcome. My name is Jeff Boleng. I'm the Special Assistant for Software Acquisition in OSD Acquisition and Sustainment. Today we're going to have the first of a series of roundtable discussions on a lot of the policy changes that are being implemented to help speed acquisition and help acquisition move at the speed of technology and speed of relevance. And our first topic today is about the new software acquisition pathway that was signed out. When was it signed out?
January 3rd.
January 3rd, signed out January 3rd. So it's hot off the presses. Hopefully, I guess we'll include a link somewhere in the distribution of this video if you haven't actually seen the new policy. And so with the roundtable today, I've got with me Ms. Stacy Cummings is to my right. She's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition Enablers. So her shop handles all of the acquisition policy. Next to her is Mr. Robert Borka, the Director of Naval Acquisition Policy in ASD, or ASN RD&A, so Research, Development, and Acquisition in the Navy. To my left is Carmela Rice, Ms. Carmela Rice. She works in acquisition enablement, and I think is one of the primary authors of the new software acquisition policy and the one that shepherded it through the process. She comes to us previously from Integrated Air and Missile Defense and a long career before that of software development, software engineering. And then on the far left over there is Major Zach McCarty. He's the chief of the F-22 Rapid Acquisition Cell, and it really has been pushing the envelope in acquisition speed and innovation for the F-22, the premier air superiority fighter in the world. Is that what we say? So after those brief introductions, a lot of this comes about because the Software Acquisition and Practices study that the Defense Innovation Board published almost a year ago now. We've been working on implementing the recommendations, the top 10 recommendations from that policy, or from that report to Congress. And one of the OSD's executive champions was Ms. Cummings. I asked her to be the executive champion for reforming policy, and she's been working to do that. So we have a series of questions about the new software acquisition policy, and we're going to jump right in. And so the first question, I've got about 8 topics with a number of questions. We actually canvassed a lot of PEOs and program managers to submit questions, which I binned into eight groups of 8 topics. And so we'll start at the very beginning where we usually start with requirements. And in the new software acquisition policy, one of the things we wanted to streamline was reduce the number of gates, of decision gates, to a very minimal set. And now there's only 2. There's 0 and 1. Is that what we call them? Mm-hmm. And so the first thing out is that a program would need to do to use the new software acquisition policy is have a capability needs statement. And we specifically were targeting that to be as lightweight as possible. So the questions that come up about requirements is, where do we start? What level of detail do we want in a capability needs statement? Who writes it? Who authorizes it? How do we ensure continuity? Some of those things. So for comment, I want to start with Ms. Cummings first on that one, and then we're going to go to Carmela, and then we'll get some of the views of the services on that. So.
Sure. So what I'd like to start with is that what we've released is an interim software acquisition pathway policy. And the reason that it's interim is that we wanted to be able to get something out there that the program managers and the services could start to use. And then in about a year, we intend to release an actual instruction. And so what you'll see in this pathway is the opportunity for our program managers really to explore and to leverage modern software techniques, leveraging the pathway in a way that is as flexible as we could make it initially so that we can learn from it. So from a requirements perspective, we're very thankful to the Congress for giving us direction this year to create a pathway for software that employs modern software techniques and that really has the goal of delivering capability from program initiation to delivering fielded capability within 6 to 12 months, which would be transformational for the Department of Defense. But as we're going to talk over the next hour, it needs to come from transformation of acquisition processes, requirements processes, other processes to do things like move tests to the left, to do things like have capability need statements that are broad and flexible and can be iterated upon. And so that's really what we're looking for, is working across the different offices of the Secretary of Defense, including the Joint Staff, to look at how we can be both specific and flexible at the same time, so that we can start out broad and iterate and specify requirements to more detail as we get closer to fielding. One of the things that you may have heard is that a lot of times what we try to do in DoD is come up with perfect requirements and deliver perfect capability, and we test to that perfect capability. If we can iterate and look to commercial best practices to deliver capability as quickly as possible, but be able to fix it, make it better, enhance it also quickly, we think that we can work with the requirements community to deliver capability in the long run faster, even though we're delivering smaller increments at a time.
Yeah, interesting. That's great context. One of the things I should have mentioned earlier is that it is a one-year sort of interim policy, similar to what we did with middle tier.
Correct.
And one of the points, at least from my perspective here, is we want to create a learning environment, right? The innovation community, commercial innovation community is all about fail fast. I always amend that statement and say fail fast but learn, right? Because if you're just failing fast, you're not learning.
In fact, I'll remind you that when you asked me to be the champion for this policy, one of the things we talked about is how do we incorporate agile techniques into the development of the policy,
right,
and how do we look at delivering something in a timely manner that might not yet be 100%, but let's get it into the hands of the PMs and let you tell us what we need to improve upon, instead of us at OSD trying to make it perfect, which may have taken another year or two to do that.
And wouldn't have been perfect.
And wouldn't have been perfect anyway. So we're really trying to live that sort of agile software development methodology and look at how we can incorporate it across other things like policy development.
So for the viewing audience, or for the users of the policy are program managers, acquisition professionals, PEOs. I guess this is a call to provide feedback. Don't be bashful about feedback on the policy, on how well the policy is working.
And the other functional areas, test requirements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everyone who is touched by the output of the software policy, we'd like to get feedback back to my office. In fact, you mentioned where can you find these policies. We do have an acquisition enablers website that also has the ability to provide feedback. So we have lots of different methods that we'll be able to collect those through the services formally, but also informally through other methods.
So part of the new policy also is a user agreement, one of the first couple of documents.
Yes, I'm very excited about that.
Maybe we should have had a user agreement with our PEOs and our PMs. All right, so I'm going to go to Carmela. If you can focus, what do you envision a good capability need statement looks like?
Well, it would be very brief. It would provide the operational context, the threats to be addressed, but beyond that, it would be high-level capability statements that just describe in general what the system needs to do from a user perspective. And then, as Ms. Cummings said, over time, we can iterate over those statements, decompose them, and do early versions of software that get at what we think that means, because oftentimes we'll have detailed requirements, but they're always subject to interpretation. So what the user envisioned may not be what the engineers design, because there's an interpretation.
Usually is not, actually.
Right, exactly. So this way you get to specify a little, build a little, test a little, and then iterate.
Got it. So one of the things I think to focus is, from a capability need statement, there's questions about who approves, but I don't think we're asking the services to change their approval process of how they identify a capability need and who owns it and who approves it, right?
Right. The only thing we are asking them to do is to speed up the process, because the current JSIDS process is a very lengthy process, and if we're going to field in 6 to 12 months, we need that process to be much faster. So we requested that the services have an expedited process, and then if it's a joint, has joint implications, then we ask the joint staff to also have an expedited process.
I actually read a press release over the weekend that General Hyten's looking at speeding up the JSIDS process, or the where there's joint equities, the process of requirements as well. So okay, make sure we covered as many of these questions as we can. All right, so I'm going to briefly. We had another question about we actually have a number of communities of practice around DevSecOps, around agile software acquisition, around all these other things. And one of the questions that I got was from somebody in the Combat Support Agency's 4th Estate that said, "Hey, you seem to be focusing your communities of practice on just the services, and they asked if we could broaden those out. So really, this is just an opportunity in the roundtable to do a shameless plug for our communities of practice and say, yes, we want everybody to participate. In fact, some of them we actually have had good participation from non-DoD people. There's some people from Treasury, and there's a lot of other people in the government moving Agile as well. GSA's got a whole lot of stuff they've been doing. So I think the DoD definitely benefits from increased community practice. So this is an open invitation for everybody to participate in the communities of practice. Again, on the acquisition website, we can have links to the communities of practice.
Another thing, in addition to the DevSecOps community of practice, we recently started another website on MillSuite to have active collaboration on the software acquisition pathway policy. So you can actually go out, download the most recent drafts, submit comments, and blog.
Awesome. MillSuite's coming along.
It's coming.
Yeah. So, all right. So I have a comment. Well, actually, first I want to ask Robert or Zach, any comments from the services on capability need statements, on how you would approach a capability need statement? We'll start over here with Robert.
So when we did middle tier, we took the same kind of approach as we're talking on the software acquisition pathway. You're not necessarily needing a JSIDS approved CDD, a GUONs, the UONs, those things are just as viable and valid as going through the full JROC process. So as we're looking at doing the software acquisition, it's in the similar vein of how at least the Navy is executing middle tier right now. The other challenge you have, though, is this is a change in the way we're doing business. Middle tier is kind of understood. I want to get something in hardware usually, or prototyped really quick to the fleet, or try to implement it. Software, we're still going to have some of those challenges with perception of, I need to tell you everything this thing must do. Take 6 months to a year, and then I'll build it. And by the time I've built it, the requirements have changed.
And technology massively moved ahead. Yeah.
Correct. So that's one of the, I think, the biggest challenges we're going to have within our requirement shops is to, again, what's the top level? And then iterate and drill down. So that's one of the things the services is going to have to, each service is going to have to challenge themselves inside their own lifelines of how they do that. Again, I think we've found the right approach for middle tier, at least in the Navy side. And so it's kind of leveraging some of those successes and gains in the same way in the software acquisition.
So Zach, I'm going to be a little more specific with you. What if I came to you and said the F-22 has to have a laser beam that shoots down a hypersonic missile? Well, how would you do a capability need statement? Something like an added capability to the platform you work on.
Sure. Yeah, as Ms. Rice said, something very broadly stated. So it might be something as, if you really wanted a laser to do that, probably just
we tried an airborne
laser,
right?
Right?
It was a really big airplane.
So probably
your
need statement would be, I need a laser to shoot this down. Now, as far as the details, so the capability need statement in my mind is really a starting point, right? And you ask, part of the question was, well, where do I start? You start with talking with your user about what they really want. No kidding, what they really want. And part of it is, how big a scale are we talking? So a laser on a Raptor is pretty big scale.
Right.
So the approval of that probably be a little higher than, say, I need this little software change, fixing on the OOP. So I would take advantage of this interim policy as a min viable policy, and the fact that the CNS process and there is no template per se or a defined approval process. Take advantage of that. Work with your user. Think what's most appropriate for who should approve it, what's the scope and level of that requirement, and the details you can figure out later along, again, with your user. So if that laser needs to shoot down a hypersonic missile, and through the course of doing business you find, it needs to have this range and these specs and so forth, that's the iterative approach that Ms. Rice was talking about, of how you would update that later once you know. But I think the scope, the broad scope, really gives you a sense of bounding what you're working on, is try to give you an idea of what is the scope of your program.
Okay, well, we're actually going to get into budget in a couple of topics, because scope and budget and defending your budget and planning your out years is hard. I wanted to ask another question. Who do you see, so everybody here has been on programs before and been PMs. You're actually the one on a program now. Who's your user? Mm-hmm. Who's the user of the F-22? The command commander? One of the pilots? I mean, I know there's multiple, but who do you?
Primarily pilots. Also, the maintainer is a key user, so there's a lot of things we do to the jet that impact the maintainer. But largely, when we say the user, we're referring to the warfighter, the guy in the cockpit, hands on the stick.
But for capabilities, commanders play a role, though, right?
Absolutely. So when we're talking big A acquisition, big R requirements of, I need this big gee whiz thing on the Raptor, usually that's a higher level decision. So some of the things we're working now, like for example, adding Link 16 to the jet, that was approved through the JROC process some time ago, and we have that overarching requirement. But as far as working with the user to understand what message type do they really value, what's priority to them, what should be our min viable product, that's something we discuss directly with pilots, representatives from ACC, Combat Command.
All right. So I got some comments, I guess as much comments as questions, basically pointing out that the trouble is not with the 5,000. And so Stacy, her shop, Acquisition Enablement, is all about the 5,000 series. It turns out I learned that there's a whole lot of other people that have their pieces of 5,000 as well over in R&E and other places. Cape's got one. But a lot of the challenges are things like security accreditation, flight safety, nuclear surety, test, the operational developmental test. So I wanted to kind of get a comment. I want to start with Robert from the services perspective on these, and how do you see, does the software acquisition pathway help these things? We're trying to pull these things left. I mean, how do we approach? They've been called tailgate processes, which I don't think does them justice. I think they should be integrated processes, but basically test, accreditation, certification, all those other things.
So from a test community perspective, I think they're on board. The test community actually has been on board for a long time with cybersecurity testing, with doing operational testing. They're ready. Hey, you bring us something to test, we're ready to go into it and bring us real world situation, what you want it to do. The enabler I see with this pathway, at least from maybe a Navy perspective, is to continue that focused discussion on the cybersecurity aspect. One of the challenges out there in that tail wagging the dog situation is how do I get to an authority to operate on software? Whether it's
continuous.
It's continuous.
If we can do it.
So we had the DICAP process. We've transitioned to RMF. And some arenas, some services have been very, very good at getting into a continuous ATO methodology and vulnerability. It's something we're challenging ourselves with the Navy and trying to identify what's that right path forward. But again, the pathway, I think, enables us and forces us to finish that discussion and get through that. The other areas of challenge that I see is tail wagging the dog is in contracting. It's one thing if we're doing software development in-house, we have the people, the personnel ready to go, and it's when you're contracting it out, there are certain challenges. There's a lot of acquisition pathways now from a software contracting perspective, OTAs and other methodologies. That's where we need to start being creative also, as well as to getting the work started. It's one thing to say I need, or I have a requirement, I have users ready to go on board, but I actually have to have someone do the work. And so that's one of the areas that it's not necessarily the pathway, but the pathway says go find the other methods, find the solutions.
Yeah, I saw a budget statistic recently that 60% of DoD budget is immediately turned over to the defense industrial base. And I think that's always going to continue, right? We need a healthy defense industrial base. So contracting is super important. I wanted to comment about the test community. I agree with you that the test community is totally on board here. In fact, I think for years they've been clamoring. They were always the ones at the end of the process that every time there was a budget hit or a schedule slip, it ate into their time. And if we integrate them in, so here's the question that I have about that is, some things take a certain amount of time no matter how big the job size is. So one of the key tenets of Agile is to reduce the batch size and do it more quickly. So there's this pervasiveness in test where if you touch one thing, I have to retest everything, right? We've been trying to get to the point where we can, by having good system engineering design, really isolate the changes and really pinpoint where in the system the change impacts. Do you see we're making progress there? And then I guess a corollary to the question is, if we decrease batch size, can test respond by not retesting everything, right? So, I mean, how do we get there?
So I think we are on that path. I think it's a lot of cultural more than technological. There's always been if you touch it, you must check everything. I think the proof will be in actually doing it. System engineering is going to be critical to this. If we can't design something well as we're building it, and we continually find that we did a viable release, we put it out there, and things are breaking, and things continue to break and not function, then that's going to drive the test community to say, if you touch one thing, we have to test it all. But I think the community is ready. I think the commercial sector is doing that. In our world, it's a risk-averse thing, and so it's being willing to fail and learn. But also, if you do the engineering proper up front, we'll fail less maybe.
Navy did a really amazing thing pretty recently with the digital twin on Aegis, where they hardware capacity's gotten to the point where they can have multiple hardware stacks on a ship running multiple releases of the software, switch over, and they actually did a live fire on a
I can't remember
a developmental version of the software, which I thought was really impressive. So, and move in this direction.
It is definitely doable. The people are ready, and I think we just need to get there. Just do it.
I wanted to ask a similar perspective from working on an Air Force program. What's your relationship with your test community, especially as you try to go fast?
Sure, yeah, we're pretty close. We do have our development test entity out at Edwards Air Force Base, the Combined Test Force, and they, as a combined force, they are also integrated closely with our operational test entity out at Nellis Air Force Base. Could always be closer, obviously, but true to Agile tenets, bringing in testers and stakeholders early to define up front what is your definition of done, and defining what those test requirements are going to be is certainly key. One challenge we have with, it's one thing to do some good rigorous engineering up front when you design a new system, but when you have an old system and it may or may not have the right rigor or design considerations where you can rely on this little change will be that little change and that's all I need to test. So we do have to do a lot of regression on our platform, but what we're looking at now is what can we automate of that regression. So it's not that we shouldn't do it, it's just can we do it in a lab, hardware in the loop, or what would be prudent to do in a lab versus on the jet, and that might result in fewer sorties.
Yeah, this pulls at our need to really increase the fidelity of our simulation environments as well.
Absolutely.
And especially multi-platform simulation environments. So, and you mentioned some systems are old systems. I have this view that all systems are old systems eventually, right?
True, yeah.
But we keep our stuff around for a long time, right? I
Sure
mean,
do.
F-35 is 20 years old now. How old's a Raptor? Over 20.
Yeah, over 20, yeah.
Yeah.
First flew in 97, I believe. So,
Right, so yeah. And it's still a pretty sexy plane. Okay, so I'm going to ask Carmela this one. There's this other 5000 thing out there called 5000.75, the Defense Business Systems. We've got this software acquisition pathway, but we also have the Defense Business Systems pathway, which I should have given a shout out to earlier, that the entire 5000 now is the adaptive acquisition framework, right? And there's 6 pathways there, everything from middle tier to major capability acquisition. What's some advice for how a PM would pick between Defense Business System or software acquisition pathway?
That's actually a very good question, a very common question. We're going to be refining both the .75 and the software acquisition pathway over the next year to make the delineation more clear. But in a nutshell, if you're doing mostly COTS and COTS integration, that's more applicable to the .75 pathway. But if you're doing custom-built software where you're writing code from scratch, that's more applicable to the software pathway.
Okay. And one of the things I didn't mention is Stacy's last job was the Defense Healthcare Management System, PEO. And would you have used the software acquisition pathway, or would you have done Defense Business Systems with that program?
Defense Business Systems.
Okay.
Certainly. We bought a commercial off-the-shelf tool. We were configuring, not customizing to the greatest extent possible. However, that was for the commercial implementation, which was MHS Genesis. The Joint Operational Medical Information System modernization program is taking parts of the commercially available tool, but the uniquenesses of the operational medicine environment requires software development, and so the software pathway is actually quite appropriate for that program, taking that legacy program and modernizing it along with incorporating commercial off-the-shelf tools. So I think that demonstrates the story I just told. When we first started talking about the adaptive acquisition framework, a lot of people assumed if you were a program officer or PEO, you lived in one lane. Within a single program, within a portfolio of programs, depending on the unique characteristics of of the capability that you're acquiring and your risk profile, there may be times when middle tier is more appropriate, or a combination of two pathways is more appropriate within a portfolio of capabilities. And so that flexibility is really all about empowering the decision authority and the program manager to work together to figure out how to reduce risk and deliver capability at the right pace. That, as you spoke of earlier, the speed of relevance.
So yeah, so this is a great segue. I'm putting off the budget question.
As long as possible.
We're going to go to the next. I want to stay with you on this one. Within a single program, the adaptive acquisition pathway, the intent is perhaps multiple pathways in a single program.
Sure.
Right, like F-22, you've got how many parallel software efforts? You've got IMIS, you've got the OFP, you've got, you know what I mean? There's multiple things, right? You could use, and it's a major capability acquisition because it's a big piece of metal, but there's a bunch of software in it too. So can you expand on how we might use multiple of the pathways in conjunction?
Sure. So I can envision a program. I like autonomous vehicles, so I'll just use autonomous vehicles as an example, where there is an element of autonomy that you want to develop using a middle tier capability. And the reason you want to is because you believe you can prototype something that would be applicable across multiple hardware types. You want to quickly prototype and get it into a fielded environment so you can test it and see if it has viability. And that because it's applicable to more than one vehicle type, that autonomy could be developed in a way that we can use open systems in order to use that for an existing large program using the major capability pathway, or several systems that are using the major capability pathway. So you may use a middle tier to prototype and to mature some technology that you then incorporate into a major capability. You may also have a major capability that requires software, and you want to develop your software in an agile manner, engaging your users, engaging the test community, but you still need to incorporate it into that hardware solution, that capability that you're fielding. And so by leveraging the software policy or the software pathway, you're able to speed getting capability in the hands of the user much quicker than you would have if you waited until you were ready to field the hardware element of it. And so I definitely can envision program managers leveraging the flexibility to get to that end result of delivering a fielded capability faster that is of a higher quality by leveraging different pathways.
Okay, yeah, and so one of the things I did not have a good appreciation of until a couple of years ago was the value of a sound acquisition strategy and having a good one going in, but then also having one that you can learn and update. And I think one of the keys to acquisition strategies as we move forward with the adaptive acquisition path or framework is picking the right pathway for the right component for the different components of your platform.
And all driven by the uniqueness of the capability, but also your risk.
Right.
So the risk really drives how you develop your acquisition strategy, and getting those decisions quickly in front of decision makers so that you can reduce your risk as you're executing your program, to me is really the key of leveraging that flexibility.
And it could be risk writ large, right? Budget risk, schedule risk, adversary risk, cyber risk, all kinds of risk.
I mean, you talk about as a program maybe starting new, it's easier in some aspects for, hey, I want a new object to go do X, Y, Z, and I can figure out and build those parts. A lot of our programs are already existing, right? So we have 85, 87 ACAT-1 level programs throughout the DoD, hundreds if not more of lower tier ACAT programs. Every program has a part of hardware and software for most of these programs. So we do have programs now that are leveraging both their traditional major capability efforts that are also doing a couple of mid-tiers. Maybe I want to upgrade some hardware. And now we have this software pathway that allows them maybe, take a missile. I have a missile today, and maybe I want to go ahead and develop a new engine for it. So maybe I do a rapid prototyping for the engine. Well, maybe I want to go rapidly field 100 of these out of my 10,000 of these missiles, so I go use the 806 authority in Congress. Well, maybe I need to change some of the fire control software and how it integrates because I want to go launch it from a fixed vehicle versus a ship. So there's these pathways are there. So now a lot of our program managers, I think, need to take a step back maybe and look at all these pathways as they're coming out, especially the software one, and find out, is it something I need to go change the strategy of what I'm doing business today?
So I actually foresee in the very near future, and it probably already exists, and a real need to take a lot of our traditional platforms and weapon systems and integrate them in ways where one sensor can cue a munition that it was never intended to do, and another one can guide it to terminal, and you know what I mean? Yeah. And there's a whole lot of that integrated C2 that needs to go on, that it's going to be a lot of software actually. So, and a lot of we want to do it rapidly too as threats emerge.
Ever seen a Marine Corps vehicle launch missiles off of a flight deck of a ship? It's happened.
That's cool. Yeah,
it's happened.
Cool.
So if I can pile on that real quick, is one issue we've seen in dealing with a platform that's perhaps a portfolio of programs, and you can scope a program any number of ways, right? If it's acquiring a certain capability, which may involve a lot of hardware and software, or just software. One problem that I've had in some of the understanding of the pathways, especially some of the new ones, is how do you scope a program? Now, when we say program, what do we mean by that, right? So we're talking about designating an act strategy, a cost estimate, a decision authority, the whole act strategy itself. What are the bounds of that program? And you could very well have multiple concurrent programs that feed into each other and are dependent on each other. And that's one problem we saw in F-22 is the number of concurrent separate programs that were being treated separately. And you're absolutely right that we do need separate pathways and separate program models. And what I would argue is that we would need program models would be defining on how you structure your program. Could be a DevOps style, could be a more traditional milestone A, B kind of model. But the authority is what I'm most interested in. And when I hear pathway, I think authority. And what's the permission and the rule book I use to govern what I've scoped as a program? So you might have multiple working together. You might have one big program with a hybrid models, if you will. So as a embedded system and continuing modernization and sustainment of that existing embedded system, I'm always a fan of a new pathway for that kind of scenario, which could look a lot like your software acquisition pathway, but it's the authority to scope what we're talking about as a program or a series of programs.
I realized also there's an art in how you decompose things and label them as a program or not.
Absolutely.
Because there's a single, we're struggling right now with, there's an emerging capability we're trying to provide that, depending on how you draw the lines, there's a big middle area between two capabilities that they won't work without this middle piece, and half the people want to include it and half to own it, and it affects. So this is going to then jump to the budgeting piece. So I'm going to ask the services this first, and then I would love the two of you to jump in. With this software acquisition pathway, one of the things that we're really trying to emphasize is we can't know, not that we don't know, I would argue we can't know all of the details of what we want and what we want to build well in advance. Mm-hmm. That drives our friends in CAPE crazy probably, and our cost estimators. So from a fairly high level capability needs statement, and I'll start with Zach, how do you create a budget that's defensible with the software acquisition pathway, knowing that you want to do continuous engineering, right? A lot of times our budget profile is lots of money on R&D, and then even ramping up lots of money in production, and then we produce a whole bunch of widgets, and then we tail way down to on sustainment, right? Sure. But then we always realize that we have to continuously add more capability, so there's blips in the sustainment curve. You know, so talk to me about how you think we can defend our budgets, or actually come up with them, good budget estimates, and defend them with the software acquisition pathway.
Sure. Yeah, so what's different about the software acquisition pathway is just what we're talking about in terms of scoping a program. Traditional programs using the 5,000 model, ACAT 1, 2, 3, are designed to be finite. You have you're done, you're delivered, FOC, move on to the next program, right? Yeah, you have to sustain it, but those are non-investment dollars, and there's different ways of scoping programmatically and financially what comes after your final delivery. What's different about the software pathway?
We never do that with hardware either, though.
Right.
Right? I mean, you've got new processors going into the F-22.
Sure.
Major capability upgrades.
So we stand up new programs.
Right.
So we treat them as if they're brand new things, but they're really just changes.
Continuous
to an
modernization.
thing.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm a fan of continuous modernization as a program pathway. Now, that's what kind of the software acquisition pathway does. It's not finite. It's admitting that software is never done, and we're going to continue to grow. You're going to scope a cost estimate. I guess it depends how you scope your particular program, of whether it's 2 years long, or you're going to take small bites of the apple, but the idea is this is a system that's going to be around for decades, like the F-22. We're scheduled to be around for decades more. So back to cost estimating. So you say, all right, you want a cost estimate for decades? That's going to be a big number. When really, if you're defining the risk, defining the decision points and so forth, that's really almost on a much shorter scale, annually or every 2-3 years. So when we're talking about bounding our programs, we need to think about what makes the most sense for what we're talking about.
So if I go in and I'm like, I want to do some autonomy software that might have applicability, I want to use open mission systems, might have applicability across a family of vehicles, but I want, I don't know, I want 50 million the first year, and I want to do a bunch of prototyping and exploration, and then I think I'm going to settle in at about 200 million a year, kind of forever to sustain this software. Would they buy it?
So I'm not so much worried about inside the building. I really am not. The worry I have is with Congress. And the proof is going to be in the pudding. They gave us the authorities. They said, go do this. Come back to us with a policy, start implementing it, tell us how it works. It's in some ways similar to how we did rapid prototyping and rapid fielding. The services try to put together funds to say, I don't know what the threat will be. I'm going to put aside some resourcing. I'm not necessarily going to be fully open with it because I don't know what it really is going to be. And Congress came back, and from appropriators don't like that, right? So appropriators want to have the money go to specific items. So we need to have a conversation with the Hill saying, hey, if we're going to set aside resources, whether it's R&D money or procurement dollars for these programs, to explain what we're doing and our methodologies behind it. One of the things that we're trying to do in the Navy right now is we have a pilot going on with a sustainment program baseline. Try and understand what really is the full tail for a program, what needs to happen, whether it's logistics, whether it's manpower, training, and so forth. Well, one of those elements that's going to need to be in there is what is about the software aspects of it. And that may be an avenue as we're piloting a couple of our first program, I think, is E2D. There's a lot of software with that program. So one of the questions will come up is, as we're looking at the sustainability, there is some sort of iterative long-term sustainment plan that's going to need to be in place. How do you tie that into a budget document? How do you sit there and show, I'm going to have some sort of agile software process? I don't necessarily know in 18 months if I need to go do, there's a new threat from an adversary that I need to go build some software for, or a threat detection. So the challenge, again, it's having an open, honest dialogue with really more the Hill. We can have that discussion internal with CAPE as part of the budget end games and so forth. I think it's easier to have that discussion inside than it is with Congress.
Got it. So I'm going to paint a little picture. I want to have Carmela and Stacy respond to this, that everybody likes leading indicators, right? They want to be predictive. They want to use data to drive decisions. So one of my arguments is we think we have leading indicators when we have big lists of requirements and big program plans about what we think we're going to go build. But what we think we're going to go build is usually not what we build. It's never the cost estimate. It's always more expensive. It always takes longer. So my argument is what we've been using as leading indicators hasn't served us well. So my counter argument there is with Agile, if our batch sizes are small enough and we're truly delivering capability to the field in 6-ish, I don't like to say 12, 6-ish months increments, maybe less. It'd be great to go less, right? Smaller increments, that maybe a lagging indicator is not so bad as long as the feedback loop is short enough. So basically the picture I'm trying to paint is, how do you feel about with CAPE and with Congress saying, you gave me 200 million, and in 6 months, this is the warfighting capability I delivered. I want another 200 million. Using that as the approval process rather than here's what I'm going to go build you teleportation, and it's only going to be $3 trillion. You know what I mean? So, do you think that would ever fly? That we could get into that kind of a program justification with Congress in the building?
So I'm going to attempt to not answer your question
and
answer other questions.
Good.
But so I think that I've talked to a lot of different people outside of the government trying to figure out how do other entities figure this out, and maybe how could we bring that into DoD. What the sort of philosophy that you just said is kind of the philosophy in commercial, which clearly.
That's where I got it.
Yeah.
It's not original thinking.
It's not original.
I have not had an original thought.
And so I do think that success is the best indicator of where we should invest our dollars. So what you're saying holds a lot of merit in that if there is a program that's delivering important capability, and then we can continue to bring investment to that program because they're able to deliver capability
because they've proven it.
Because they've proven that they can. So I think that there's a lot of merit in thinking about how do we look at the structure of how we think about investments that way. It is a good idea for us to do. Thinking about trying to completely change the dynamic and how the executive branch governs the budget process may be a little harder.
I'm sure.
But I will say that, as I said earlier, I think that the Congress has clearly told us they want to see us speed up delivery of capability. They think software is a place where we've lagged significantly. So it's an area ripe for us to make some transformational changes. And if we have some ideas around how budgeting and that process can help us, then we should certainly put those on the table. One of your recommendations, not your personally, the DIB swap recommendations around software appropriations, where we get after the problem of our R&D procurement and O&M dollars sort of driving us into that waterfall model, looking at appropriations in a new way. I think we have some great ideas around piloting some appropriation changes. Hopefully we'll see success in that area. And again, like I said, that success will give us the credibility that we need, I think, to look at different mechanisms. So did I not answer your?
No, that was actually great. It was honestly, I'm not being patronizing. It was great because it also foreshadowed the software appropriation, software color of money that we've talked about so much, which is a topic of a future roundtable. So hopefully people will tune in again. I want to go ask Carmela this pretty much a similar same question, and maybe let's treat this. You mentioned 80 some. Between 85 and 90 ACAT 1 programs, right? Those are the ones that get all the visibility because that's where the big chunks of dollars is. But there are literally hundreds or even probably thousands of smaller programs. Maybe that might be the right place to start. Carmela, I want to get your response on that too. Sort of justifying and defending your budget differently, start on smaller programs maybe, I don't know.
That's actually a good idea. And the software pathway policy actually caters to the concept that you described, because one of the elements of the pathway is to have a value assessment at least once a year. And that value assessment is an assessment from the end user's perspective regarding what value the software actually brings to the operational mission. So that would go a long way towards justifying your budget request for the following year. So,
yeah. And actually, you can actually achieve amazing capability with surprisingly small investment with software. There's a story people probably already know because it's decades old about Cursor on Target, which Cursor on Target is a little XML schema and some software libraries that MITRE developed that allows interoperability to exchange targeting data or location data, track data between command and control systems. It was a shockingly small investment and it enabled massive amounts of capability and interoperability. So, yet again, I'm solely software proponent. So, so we talked about that one. Let's do this. Oh, we're doing very well on time. We need to talk about systems engineering. I think before the cameras rolled, we were talking. There's system engineering policy. 5,000 system engineering policy is R&E. It's theirs. We talked about having a lot of rigor in system engineering. So I want to talk about where. Well, first I want to say, where does acquisition policy, pure acquisition policy, and system engineering policy, what are the touch points? How do they integrate? I want to start with Stacy on this one.
Sure. So in the past, we keep talking about the 5,000. When we talk about the 5,000 in this audience, we're generally talking about the DoD Directive 5000.01, which describes the system, and the legacy DoD 5000.02, which was the one-size-fits-all,
the
MDAP type process that was meant to be highly tailorable, but really ended up kind of giving you all of the alternatives in a that ended up becoming sort of a checklist, which is what the adaptive acquisition framework is meant to break apart, is to sort of force that, not what do I tailor out, what do I not do, but really what do I do? What is necessary in order to have a successful program. So that tailoring in perspective. So previously, that 5000.02 had a series of annexes, and those annexes included the systems engineering, program protection planning, things like that. And
that's another one, yeah.
As
The
part
program
of,
protection plan.
So as part of this complete transformation of our policy, the DoD 5000.02 will become a description of this adaptive acquisition framework, and the experts are going to rewrite their engineering policy. So when we think about systems engineering from an acquisition perspective, it is highly integrated and highly necessary. And my perspective is, having been a program executive officer and previously being a logistician, is that the best time to be building in your systems engine, reliability, maintainability, cybersecurity, good architecture is at the very beginning. And who is going to do that for you? It's your systems engineering team on your program. So how do you incorporate the rigor and the good systems engineering policies and processes while not creating burdensome paperwork and oversight? We want to push responsibility to the lowest possible level. We want to incorporate all these great aspects of systems engineering and all the great outcomes that come from them and only add those things that are value added, not additional oversight and paperwork that slow the program down. Clearly, that's a balance. And actually, as Zach, you were mentioning earlier, the bigger the scope is, the more eyes you want on it. And the smaller the scope is, then you can probably take some risks on that oversight and paperwork that's required. So how do you balance the acquisition strategy that's 3 slides versus the acquisition strategy that's a few pages? Same thing with your systems engineering approach. How do you balance getting the right oversight and rigor to the risk profile of your program and the scope of your program? But if you ask me, the best time to do it is as early as possible. You build it in, and then it isn't a burden because you built it into your existing processes from the moment you started your program.
So I'm going to go to Carmela with this one. You've worked missile defense, very complicated, very big system engineering challenges, big systems, integrating a lot of components, a super hard problem. How do you do just enough system engineering to get to where you're delivering capability quickly and early, but not creating a mess? You know what I'm saying? If you don't do enough system engineering early, right, you end up creating a mess that's non-maintainable, or any of the ilities. It's not secure. It's, you know what I mean? You don't get the right ilities that you want. Not affordable. How do you do just enough?
I think it's about scoping. The first thing that you need to do from an engineering perspective is to understand what the piece parts of your system are, and you scope it such that when you go off and do just enough software development or software engineering, you're not affecting the whole enterprise, right? So once you've broken your system down into piece parts, you can go off and create smaller elements of the program that you then bring back together.
So it's sort of how it's the kind of the art of design, right? How
Correct.
you decompose your system.
Correct.
And then I'm going to jump over to F-22 on this. Well, actually, you comment on this first. There's the concept of, and I don't remember who said it first. I heard this recently, but started the mantra of the government owning their tech baseline a little more. To me, what that means is that 1 or even 2 level down system decomposition is actually, and system engineering and interfaces is actually owned by the government, so that we can actually compete best performers for more granular sort of tasks.
Yes.
Where was I going with the question? How do you feel? Do you think, is the government, are we qualified to start doing that?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I worked on integrated air and missile defense before I came here. And
I know you did this, that's why I
and we actually did that. We took delivery of all of the source code and everything in the baseline, and we actually, with an organic software team, added a new missile to existing command and control and existing sensors, and we did a successful flight test with a government-run team. So we were able to take all of that and create our own development environment, and without the prime's help, we were able to go and build new capability. So we absolutely have the capability to do that.
So technical capability, check, awesome. how do we balance that with not threatening our industrial base?
Well, I don't.
Because sometimes it's if the government does the work, the industrial base sees themselves as not getting the work, right? So how do we balance that?
Well, I don't think that we would want to take everything in-house. The thing that we did was a very small effort, so it would have been more costly to have the prime do it, but it also wouldn't have been as financially motivating for them because it was such a small effort. So I think for the larger things, we still need our industrial base, but if we want to do small one-offs or if we want to add small increments of capability, I think we have the ability to do that.
Okay. And then Zach, correct me if I'm wrong. F-22 is in this, or has been in the process for a while of doing what I'm saying, regaining the technical baseline. Is that accurate, or has it always been there?
Well, from a data rights perspective, so decisions were made long ago on our program of taking delivery of data rights or not. So as far as owning the IP, it's not really been changing much recently on F-22. But in terms of technical discipline and system engineering rigor, we're absolutely right that more rigor is even required in this new agile way of doing business rather than the old way. There's not less rigor at all, but I would caution folks to think through that more rigor does not mean more bureaucracy or more paperwork, right? More rigor means there may be a different way of doing business. For example, and this is not necessarily specific to F-22, and this is a challenge for us, so we're trying to implement it as well, but notionally where we're trying to get to is if you have a requirement, let's say a rather small software-driven requirement from your user, they want something on a screen or some feature with their software, a good requirements verification process instead of the traditional way of having a very thoroughly documented requirement, going down your system engineering V on how well that's defined, and then going up the V on how you verify that and have detailed verification plans and so forth. Instead of doing all that for an entire big system, if you just deliver a min-viable product, bring in your user, have him or her try it out, and they say, yeah, this is what I want, or here's some of the feedback, here's what I would change. That's still rigorous, but at a much lower scale, and it's probably a lot easier than doing all that paperwork. Not that we're trying to get out of paperwork, we're trying to deliver something.
In my view, we're trying to get out of paperwork.
We are. The reason we're doing it is to deliver real value to your user,
right? And
we want to do so with doing less paperwork. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll give a shout out to the digital engineering strategy that Arnie published recently. It's got if we get to the place where we do model-based systems engineering and we develop a high-fidelity model, a digital model of a system, that can then drive both building the thing, sustaining a digital twin, and feeding a simulation environment to interoperate with other things. And we should never have that thing printed, right? I actually think there are some programs now that are, or actually I know there are some programs now that are, the deliverables in the program are not paper plans. They're delivery of digital models. And so I think the more we go down that path, the better off we are as well. So,
one of the beauties, though, of doing an agile approach, using Scrum technique, is doing that iterative process at small builds. So, today, I want system X to do X, Y, and Z. You go ahead and you do a complex engineering plan, a long build process, and you go out and test it, and you hope it works. And then you find a lot of faults, and then you go fix them, and then you retest it all again. By doing the iterative approach, the small scale approach, it's not that you're cutting out a whole engineering process. In fact, you're doing it more frequently, more rapidly. Like just direct to the thing, right? Bring the user in. You want this on the screen? Does it actually work? Well, yeah, it works, but I need to do this. And you find out the requirements may say this, but you find out when the user, they said this, but they forgot, this one little piece. Just ask a kid, how would you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? And they'll tell you 7 steps maybe. And then you say, okay, follow those 7 steps, right? How well did you really think it out? And then they go do it, and you said, but you never said to go get a knife to go spread the peanut. It's those parts process, and I think that some of the agile methodologies with software, it can really help you do a better and more robust engineering. Just you're doing it in smaller parts and pieces, not this huge laborious process.
Yeah, I've always said that if you're doing sort of, I don't know what true agile is, but doing true agile, true lean type stuff, you're actually increasing your rigor, because it's like the bad analogy I use is you're doing more reps with lighter weights, right? You're actually exercising the same muscles through the same range of motion, just far more often. And I think that actually builds muscle memory better than...
Well, I think that was one of the definite lessons learned out of the Agile pilots that we initiated over the last couple of years, is that moving to Agile, it's not easier. It's
definitely
probably harder, but it's all about what the output is and the capability that you're getting into the hands of the user.
Okay, so we have the software acquisition pathway interim policy, rolling out other components of the adaptive acquisition framework. What do the services do next? So I'm going to start with you, actually, with Stacy.
Okay.
What would like your perfect vision of now that we're and truly, and I believe this, and I've been talking to a lot of stakeholders lately that ANS has really been trying to, in the enablement process, your office is named Acquisition Enablers. We're really trying to enable the services, enable the programs to deliver high quality capability at speed. And the days of oversight and micromanagement, we're hoping are gone, but some of the sentiment from some of the services and programs is the level of trust, we're not fully there yet. So in a perfect world, where do you see the services taking the policy now?
So I guess what I would ask of the military departments, now that we've gotten a handful of these transformational policies completed, and with a few more to go, is first and foremost to communicate that out to the workforce. And so we have established a communication plan within OSD. This is part of it, but getting out to the Defense Acquisition University, having the DAU instructors do quick training, team-based training, incorporating this transformation into the formalized training processes. We are going to have the DOU website completely transformed in a way that it is much more interactive. You should see that probably by early February, the first stages of how we're transforming that communication. But frankly, I worked for the Navy for far longer than I worked for the Department of Defense. I wanted to hear from my Navy leadership. And when I was in a SysCom, I wanted to hear from my SysCom leadership. And so what I would ask the services to do is to take everything that we've done to empower program managers, be more flexible, and then turn it into their service policies, communication, and processes, because it will not be codified, even if it's codified in OSD policy, until it really gets into the hands of the program managers through their service leadership, and our decision authorities start to take advantage of these flexibilities. If I were a program manager in a service, I wouldn't believe it until I got it from my service leadership. So that's what I would ask.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. And in some ways, that always, the way our bureaucracy works is frustrating sometimes. That it's almost like every level in the chain on the way down, they want to add a little bit more policy and a little bit more policy and a little bit more policy. So I hope that's not what happens, but we'll see. So same question to you, Carmela. What's the perfect world look like for you for the services moving forward with this pathway?
I think the Air Force is really spearheading this effort for us, and I think that having the other services kind of get on board with establishing enterprise-level services that can be used throughout the service, so that each PEO and PM doesn't have to go out and figure out how to build their own pipeline, for example. I think that would be a major step forward for all of the services. Oh,
that's a soapbox of mine, actually, is that every program rebuilds. There's an analogy that Kenny Bowen uses always that I love, is that anytime we ask a program to cook us a meal, we want to just get fed. The program finds an old shopping mall and they tear it down and they build a Bobby Flay's kitchen and a Wegmans on one side and a Williams-Sonoma on the other, and they build all that infrastructure just to cook us a meal. And every single program builds that infrastructure over and over and over again. So enterprise services I'm very bullish on enterprise services. So I'm gonna finish with you. So I'm gonna go over to the Navy and ask Robert, what's next for the services with the software acquisition?
Well, I have a
pathway?
200-page policy ready.
Awesome! Yay! All right, good. Because you have to interpret all of the things we
Exactly,
said.
no,
Yeah. You have to Navyize it. It's got to be stern to stammer. So whatever.
Exactly. So right with Carmel, that's a big enabler, right? Having the tools to actually do the process is so key. I know the ASNRDA leadership is talking with N2 and N6 about tool sets in the accreditation process and how do you do continuous monitoring. So that's one of the big enablers that we have to get through. I think the Air Force has gotten a step ahead on the services, rightly so, with the way they're doing the software factories and Kessel Run and Platform One. So there's a lot to be learned from the services and how we're all doing business. I think the other part in the Navy is to try to find some programs to actually make sure we pilot. Mm-hmm. It's great to say we have this policy, but you said you're looking for feedback. We do the same thing, right? So we have a huge Tiger team on looking at all these policies and getting the information out. But if no one's actually doing it and trying it, I'm really happy to work for Secretary Gertz, who is really about innovation, speed, relevance, getting something to the warfighter really when it's needed, not when we 5-10 years from now. So you have the support from the leadership to move fast and do things. But like I said, getting it out to the SysComs, getting it out to PEOs, again, identify programs to try it out with, build the capabilities and the tool sets out there, learn from the other services, and the reality is get down to the program office and teach them. Because this is a different way of doing business, and how many times do you find out, even industry, if you want to go change something, you really got to talk to the people who are doing it, not just, hey, this is a great tool set, go put it in your toolbox. It's how do you actually do it and implement it. So that's where we're looking forward to working with OSD, with DAU, and the services on actually teaching our workforce, and learning from the workforce. That's our next step. No policy, no 500-page policy. Yeah. I'm increasing every time I talk about the policies.
So one of the things that I'm constantly impressed by, and I don't think we acknowledge enough, is how many actual government developers and engineers we have doing software. I was on a phone call the end of last week with the folks at Dahlgren. Is that Nywick?
NSA, Naval Service Warfare
Yeah,
Center, Dahlgren.
that's them, yeah. And you're going to go down and visit them at the end of the week. They've got a couple of thousand engineers, over hundreds of programs, and they own the source code repositories, and they're making changes and major capability improvements in those things every day. Yep. And the Air Force similarly at the software engineering centers in the Air Force, and then the Army's got similar capability. So I'm going to go from the PM perspective. So you're in charge of sort of an acquisition policy for the Navy. Yep. So you're sort of Stacy's counterpart for the Department of the Navy. You're at a program in the Air Force. What do you want to see from your leadership with this?
Yeah,
Use this as an opportunity. Be careful.
Sure. Ooh, watch out. No, I totally agree on the point of service level policy. You've got to be careful about that because 5002 right now, I forget the exact page count. I used to know it was like 174 pages. The Air Force acquisition policy that implements that policy is the Air Force instruction that is literally one page more than 5002. Not to be outdone. Now, there's some things in there that...
This kills me.
There's some things in that Air Force instruction that are necessary for and how we track programs within the Air Force. But largely, we don't need a regurgitation or a restating of the pathways or how to do business. So streamlined regulation and policy at the component level and also the DoD level is preferred. And then we would love vast series of guides, right? Lessons learned, best practices, but let's take those out of regulation. Let's have a huge library on DAU or wherever we want to put it in the communities of practice where program managers and other acquisition professionals can go and reference all that. Doesn't have to be in regulation. And then also we talked about the enterprise services, so there's some statements made about the Air Force taking some steps there, and I totally agree. For a while there, we were, everyone got the memo, go to the cloud, go do platform as a service, go do it, and then everyone.
That was like perfect storm raindrops. That memo was worded interestingly.
Yes, and so everyone went off. Oh, I guess we got to go find the cloud, and every program was trying to find their own solution. And more recently, though, I think the Air Force has centralized efforts with a program called Cloud One and Platform One, and it's designed to be or envisioned to be a one-stop shop for everyone, whether you're doing enterprise services organically with a Kessel Run or a software engineering center, or with a contracted developer, a GFE, the cloud, if you will. So we're trying to do that as well. A lot more work to be done there because there's all kinds of different security levels of cloud and platforms that we need, but we are on the right path, and I'm very excited about that.
We might get Jedi soon, actually, as
Sure.
well, from an enterprise capability. I was reminded a few weeks ago that between the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulations, the DFAR, the defense version, and the FMR, it's like 11 or 12,000 pages of regulation. But you described it best to me when, I think it was you or Phil Cadman that was saying, what really needs to be in policy.
Right.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, it's basically granting of authority and decision levels is what really should be in policy, and really nothing else. Is that right?
And that's really what we're trying to do with the rewrite of the OSD level policies around acquisition, is put policy in our policy statements. So, for example, the middle tier instruction was, I think, 7 pages of content, not 174, but 7 pages of content, because there's a guide that goes along with it. Same thing with the industrial intellectual property policy. So policy is telling you what you must do or giving you authority to do something. A guidebook is telling you how to do it. We don't need to put how to do it in our policies.
Right.
We need to put how to do it in guidebooks, because how you do it is going to change much more frequently than the policy of what you need to do or what authorities that you have. And that was the big rationale for how we are restructuring the series of acquisition policies, is so that we can be more agile and iterative in our policy updates.
And in our how approach, right?
Right.
As long as we have these little involatile whats.
Exactly.
And I would offer that doing it that way, pulling the how out of there, even including, I was really pleased in the 5000.80, the middle tier, that we didn't talk about milestones or any of that. Those are in the guides. That's
Right.
great. What that forces us to do as program managers running programs is to really think critically of what do I need to do and how do I structure a program.
One of our tenets, critical
Exactly.
thinking.
Yeah.
So,
Good job.
so that is a key point of how to do that and change the culture, because I really do believe, actually, I think it was General Polakowski, before she retired, said something to the effect of acquisition reform or changing and doing things better is 5% regulation change, 5% statutory change, 90% culture. At first, I didn't believe that. I do now, by looking at how the regs are structured and the tailorability that's there. It's just our system and our culture doesn't really adhere to that very well or leverage it.
Okay, so I want to thank all 4 of you for the lively discussion and all the input, and for being here. I really do appreciate it. I think it helps get the word out. I think it helps communicate, and this will be out in there in the interwebs for all of
Forever.
posterity. Yeah. So we're about out of time. I want to go in reverse order, this way and then this way. Just quick closing comments about anything that you want to just throw in.
Sure. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it. Try to be a voice for the working level program manager who has to implement this policy every day, or all policies from the acquisition world. So I really like the path we're on. The fact that we've recognized we need different pathways is key. The work of Ms. Rice and Ms. Cummings and your whole team to really change the way we do business and help that 5% of regulation change that might need to happen really helps facilitate the rest of the 95%. So I look forward to things to come. I appreciate your willingness to take feedback on policy. True Agile tenet, right, is feedback from your user. We're your user. So
That's a sincere ask, actually.
It is.
By the team that I know right now at OSD, it's a sincere ask to give feedback on this thing.
Right.
So.
And true to form, but we're never going to get policy or software right up front. We're always going to change it going forward. So I appreciate your willingness to listen.
Carmel, parting shots?
I'm very, very excited about this pathway, and I look forward to working with all of the services and the other functional areas to improve the pathway as we go forward. And I want to remind everyone of the Mill Suite Software Acquisition Pathway Community of Interest, which is where you can go online and directly provide feedback, download, like I said, current drafts of the policy, give us red lines, blog about it, etc.
Okay. Robert?
Yep. From the Navy, happy to be here and glad to have the opportunity to discuss with you. You always learn something new every time you talk with different practitioners in the community. We don't know it all. The reality is we only see from our experiences and what we have seen and done. From the Navy side, we continue to solicit our program managers, the acquisition community, to provide feedback not only to OSD but keep us in the loop too, because you never know what you might hear and who you can help out with some additional information. I think the adaptive acquisition framework is absolutely fantastic in terms of breaking things up into the parts and pieces. Having lived the dream of trying to rewrite an entire DoD 5000 and having rewrote the SecNav 5000 last year, when you put everything in one bucket, it becomes very, very challenging, and you can't be agile to changes, whether it's congressional or realities of how we do business. So kudos to OSD for taking this approach and providing a little bit of a push. I think it's good to have a little bit of push from the OSD on guidance to get the services to maybe take some steps in appropriate directions.
Great. So I will reiterate that I do believe that the customer of acquisition policy are the program teams directly. We write the policy for the sole purpose of enabling the department to implement the National Defense Strategy, and in order to do that, we need programs teams to think critically, to be empowered, and to have the flexibility to do what they need to do. And since you need to say things multiple times for them to be remembered, the unique characteristics of a program and the unique risk profile of a program, get those two, understand those two things, then you can leverage the flexibility of the program, of the policy. Just like we've heard a lot, the existing or the traditional pathway, the major capability MDAP pathway, has always been tailorable. But we didn't see programs able to take advantage of that. And that is why Ms. Lord tasked us with transforming the acquisition system to enable you, the program teams, to tailor in the requirements based on the capability that you're acquiring, and work very closely with your decision authority so that you can get decisions made quickly. And I sincerely appreciate my team as well as the service teams who worked together to get these policies out in record time. We have 6, I think, policies that have been signed and published since the end of December, and I'm pretty sure that that's a record for any one community. So congratulations, and look forward to your feedback. Thanks.
So I want to thank Ms. Cummings, especially for the leadership with the adaptive acquisition framework. I think it's a watershed. I honestly do in our ability to acquire stuff. And Carmela, you for doing a lot of the heavy lifting with the software acquisition pathway. It's the one I'm most near and dear to my heart. And now it's a challenge to the services and the programs to run. So to be a little corny for all of us here at Acquisition Update, we'll call that a wrap, and I'll do my Dennis Miller impression. So anyway, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.